which is why Hamas has reasserted its red line that it will not give up its arms, just as Hezbollah has reasserted that red line. And I think, after the anniversary of the murder of Hassan Nasrallah, it's increasingly clear what role Hezbollah has played, which is to keep Israeli troops and Israeli occupiers out of Lebanon and protect the Lebanese people from them. And if they...
Good evening, I am Deepak Kumar and you are watching USN News. Today we are joined by a very special guest, Max Blumenthal, an American journalist, author and the founder of the Grey Zone, a news website known in the depth, investigate, reporting and critical analysis of US foreign policy and global affairs. Max, it's pleasure to have you on us.
Well, just a quick point on that. Netanyahu threatened Iraq in his speech at the UN General Assembly. Many might have missed that. He was threatening the popular mobilization forces. And so any mobilization by the US in the region to support an Israeli strike could go beyond Iran at this point. Netanyahu, I think he held up the his graphic on the blessing and the curse. And the curse extends deep into Iraq. And this is a problem for the United States because the popular mobilization forces have at least temporarily or momentarily helped stabilize Iraq by integrating with the Iraqi military. These aren't militias. And that has prevented operations on US bases that are right there. So Israel is threatening the stability that has, at least momentarily, benefited the United States. Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian came to New York with a pretty clear agenda, which was to carry out a last-ditch attempt to prevent snapback sanctions, which of course failed. It was a done deal. The hypocritical E3 of the Europeans was determined to impose this no matter what. They cannot allow the economic and hybrid war on Iran to end or to extend, as the Russian and Chinese delegations sought to just extend the JCPOA for 6 more months. They couldn't let that happen. And the Europeans went along completely with the unprovoked Israeli assault on Iran back in June. But Iran, and this government in particular, want to use every ounce of negotiating leverage that they have and send a signal back to the parts of the Iranian public which are, I guess, less politically inclined to support the Islamic Republic, that they've tried everything and that there's nothing they can do, and that they've essentially been betrayed by their negotiating partners before the next round of war. So I was invited with a group of journalists and think tank analysts and peace activists to a on-the-record meeting outside the UN with Pezeshkian, and his message was pretty simple. War, for sure they will attack Iran again. Those were his words. And he even forecasted the scenario of his own assassination or an attempt on his life. And it was reported that Pezeshkian escaped narrowly from an Israeli assassination attempt in the last round. And he wanted to send the message that Iran is prepared for all contingencies, including his own assassination. They have prepared 5 to 6 steps ahead. I listened with some trepidation and, I guess, horror to your interview with my friend Mohammed Marandi, where he said pretty much the same thing, that Iran is prepared to replace him as well. This is someone who's not even in the government, who is just a private commentator, but he plays such a prominent role with his command of the facts and the English language in international media that he had to consider that Israel would target him as well. Israel's just this gigantic assassination machine that has been slaughtering any journalist in the Gaza Strip. So now even private commentators in Iran have to consider that they could be a target on their back. This is what Iran is mobilizing for. And Pezeshkian was also speaking to us because we have a direct channel to the American public. There were figures from the American Conservative magazine there and figures from the left. So he was basically speaking to the part of the public, the American public that's anti-war. And one of his principal complaints was the concept of terrorism, especially after Israel's attack on Qatar, where it attempted to wipe out the entire Hamas negotiating team in order to eliminate, just end negotiations altogether, but that it attacked inside a U.S. ally. The attack struck a building that was in a densely populated neighborhood in Doha. School was getting out at that time. And he said, why are we called the terrorists when Israel is waging not just a 7-front war and slaughtering children in Gaza, but attacking inside a U.S. ally in a densely populated civilian neighborhood, carrying out assassinations around the world? It was something that he spent a lot of time and breath on complaining about, was the Western understanding of terrorism. And finally, Pezeshkian sort of solicited views on how relations could be improved between the U.S. and Iran, because he has seemingly given up on any ability to move the American president and his administration. He said that Steve Witkoff, the Middle East envoy, would come to Doha for these meetings, negotiations. And he said someone should have recorded this, because he would tell us something very positive about all the progress we were making, moving back to a new deal. And then he would go back to Washington and issue bellicose demands of us that sounded like Israel had told him what to say. The hypocrisy was so astounding, they don't believe they can work with the Americans again. My question to Pezeshkian was to simply quote from a speech delivered by Iran's leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, on September 23rd, where he said that negotiating with the Americans at this point, after what had just happened, would be a declaration of national surrender. And I asked Pezeshkian if that was reflective of his view, partly because of the format of the meeting, because there would be 2 rounds of questioning, and then Pezeshkian would respond kind of in a generalized form, summing up all of the questions. I only got a generalized answer from him that was not a yes or no, which was unfortunate. And Abbas Araghchi, the foreign minister, was seated beside him and interjected at one point during the meeting that in 2018, Israel struck the Natanz facility with an explosive device. They destroyed something like 4,000 centrifuges. And the point of the Israeli attack was to sabotage negotiations with the Americans. But the Iranian negotiating team continued negotiating while increasing enrichment to somewhere near 60%. That was their response. And he was suggesting this will be our response going forward, and that they are flexible about enrichment levels, but only if they receive sanctions relief. That was the message from Araghchi.
Max, when it comes to Iran and the war with Iran, do you see that the main objective of the United States and Israel are the same, or they're somehow different in the way that they see the conflict, the war with Iran?
How can we even define an American objective in Iran at this point, independent of Israel? The American objective has been outlined by Israel and shaped by Israel over the course of several decades. So there is no distinct American objective. The American objective should be to negotiate with Iran for mutually beneficial win-win trade deals and import-export deals so the U.S. can have cheaper gas. I mean, that's what the U.S. objective should be. But Iran supports resistance in the region to the Gaza genocide. A genocide I consider to be continuous over decades. That's the only reason this is happening. There's no need to pillage Iran to get favorable deals on oil, and ultimately following the Israeli objective into the next round could lead to the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, which would devastate the global economy and worsen the condition of the American consumer, who's already beginning to suffer the effect of Trump's maximalist, erratic tariffs. So the Israeli objective is Netanyahu's objective, which is regime change. And that becomes the American objective. And the pretext is 60% enriched uranium stockpiles exist somewhere in Iran. So we have to summon all of these US aircraft and send more and more of our dwindling THAAD missile stock to defend Israel as it prepares for another attack. It's like the pretext on Venezuela. The Department of Justice and CIA created a fake cartel, declared that Nicolas Maduro is the head of this cartel, and that the US must attack inside Venezuela to eliminate cartels, to save the lives of Americans who are being poisoned. And anyone who's stupid enough to believe that will actually support the real objective of Marco Rubio and the Gusano Industrial Complex in South Miami, in South Florida, which is regime change. The war on drugs, the war on terror, these are just phony pretexts for US intervention. And in both cases, the United States is following the agenda of a malign fifth column that seeks to exploit US military and economic power to carry out its narrow sectarian agenda. With respect to Iran, Israel has lost the element of surprise that it exploited using the negotiations to attack Iran. I guess it was on June 10th, June 13th, when it killed numerous off-duty IRGC commanders and nuclear scientists. They've lost that at this point, and there's no negotiation to lull Iran into a false sense of security. They've also lost much of their capacity. It would seem that they've lost much of their capacity to attack from within through Mossad cells, especially with these sort of hidden drone bases inside Iran, which did do a lot of damage. There were a lot of deportations of Afghan migrants who were said to be sort of a base for Mossad recruitment inside Iran. They've lost that. But the most important thing they've lost, and Pezeshkian spoke to this, is the threat of regime change from within, from the Iranian people. I think it was the killing of civilians and like car bombings in Tajrish in North Tehran, where you have like a whole part of the population that opposes the Islamic Republic, the sort of middle and upper class, starts to come under attack, and they begin to rally around the flag and support the military. But there was one event during the last 12-day conflict that I think really encapsulates the Israeli failure, and it was the attack on Evin prison, which is the prison that's said to hold political prisoners and dissidents. And the Israelis, in this delusional neoconservative fever brain state, thought that if they attack with a missile strike the gate of Evin prison, it would send a signal to all of the Iranians who hate the Islamic Republic to come out in the streets and that Israel will liberate them. What they wound up doing was they killed a number of prisoners, they killed social workers, and they killed family members who were visiting the prisoners. And the Iranian public reacted with complete disgust, including exiled dissidents who are backed by the West, like Narges Mohammadi condemned this. What's that lady? The lady with the hair condemned it, whose name I forget right now, who's just like basically a CIA asset. That was the Israelis. So the Israelis completely failed to create chaos in the streets. And this round, I think, this next coming round will look much different. And the idea of regime change is off the table. It's going to be a much more violent round of conflict. And I think the Israeli objective here, going back to the beginning of my comments on this question, is to drag the U.S. in even more deeply, possibly get the U.S. to deploy more of its naval assets, to get the U.S. in a much more close quarters combat with Iran, and ultimately boots on the ground. Every American death against Iran will be a death of American soldiers for Israel. That's the fact.
Matt, Donald Trump is talking about his peace deal for the situation in Gaza. And what's so amazing that they don't mention the right of Palestinians, Gazans, to decide about their future. What do they want to be? What is the future in their mind? And what is, when you look at these 21 points that he's mentioning in this, which is, in your opinion, what points are most important, the most important points in the peace deal? And is that going to be possible with what's going on in Gaza? Because Netanyahu came out and said he doesn't care about, but he's not going to withdraw from Gaza. So what's the point, after all, with this peace plan, in your opinion?
It's all been cooked up by the Israelis, this 21-point peace plan. And it's a ruse to paint Hamas as rejectionists after they have accepted virtually every proposal, which then, then they get rugged by the U.S., which says, oh, well, we had a proposal, and then they go back and say, well, Hamas actually rejected it because Netanyahu changes the proposal, then the U.S. accepts Netanyahu's changes. So this was a more sophisticated propaganda ruse to present a detailed, coherent package. It took them a long time to get it together. They needed to demolish much of Gaza to create the sense that there was a day after that was coming and imminent. And they needed to get Tony Blair on board as the sort of L. Paul Bremer, referring to the head of the Coalition Provisional Authority that was a complete, absolute disaster for the Iraqi people during the U.S. occupation of Iraq, repackaged for Gaza with various tech solutions that will benefit Tony Blair and his Tony Blair Institute, which has received something like $300 million from Larry Ellison, the ultra-Zionist billionaire who runs Oracle, the CIA and Israeli data contractor. And these are all incentives that were, Tony Blair is just basically seeing green here. So you have Tony Blair as the head of the Gaza International Transitional Authority. I just looked over their institutional structure documents, and it's laughable. There's a section on property rights for people in Gaza who are acknowledged in the documents as being encouraged to voluntarily migrate, but it says there will be a board to make sure that their property rights are respected. Yeah, right. Then in the 21-point plan, there's this whole, the emphasis is on Hamas being de-radicalized. No one's going to be de-radicalized when you've destroyed their homes, ruined their lives, and continue killing their family members. But it's de-radicalization under occupation. This has always been a fantasy. It's like when Hillary Clinton would talk about getting the hate out of Palestinian Authority school books, but without ending the occupation. Hamas leaders will supposedly be given, and members will be given, safe passage if they put down their arms. And then utopia will ensue. It's an absolute joke. This is a pacification plan to continue the genocide with the support of at least figures who are known in the international community. And it will not end the violence against Gaza because, as we've seen in Syria, when Syria agreed to be pacified under the imposed leadership of former al-Qaeda leader Ahmed al-Sharaa, Israel has continued to attack day after day, week after week, destroying the remnants of the Syrian Arab army, destroying potential bases that Turkey was setting up to train the new Syrian army. The attacks continue. I believe yesterday in Quneitra, the Israeli army actually displayed Israeli flags in the occupied Golan. And this was all while Ahmed al-Sharaa was returning from New York, where he met with one of Netanyahu's top billionaire cutouts, Ronald Lauder, who has donated millions and millions of dollars, not just to the Israel lobby, but also to support Israeli settlement activity. No matter what he does, Syria continues to be occupied, continues to be attacked. So if the resistance in Gaza gives up, they will get the same treatment. Look at what's happening in southern Lebanon. There is a ceasefire between Hezbollah and Israel. And what is Israel doing? It's waging its strategy of war between wars, or mowing the lawn, where it continues to kill members of Hezbollah, continues to attack the homes of the population in southern Lebanon, and create pressure on the puppet government of Nawaf Salam to disarm Hezbollah along with the US. So this plan is not a peace plan. It is a pacification plan, and it will lead to further extermination of large numbers of the population in Gaza, which is why Hamas has reasserted its red line that it will not give up its arms, just as Hezbollah has reasserted that red line. And I think, after the anniversary of the murder of Hassan Nasrallah, it's increasingly clear what role Hezbollah has played, which is to keep Israeli troops and Israeli occupiers out of Lebanon and protect the Lebanese people from them. And if they do disarm, you will see Israel move in up to the Litani River and begin to take an increasingly aggressive role on Lebanese territory. Mark my words.
Max, there is some sort of difference between the United States and Israel when it comes to Syria. Al-Shara was talking with General Petraeus. He said that your success is our success. Where is that position come from? You look at Israel is not that much comfortable with the situation in Syria and the role of Turkey, and you see the United States somehow trying to calm the situation, bring them together. After all, who's Al-Shara to General Petraeus that he sees that his success is General Petraeus' success?
It raises a lot of questions about who Al-Shara, aka Mohammed Jolani, was when he came out of Camp Bucca. And it sends a insulting message to the families of American veterans who were told that they were fighting terrorism during the surge in Iraq that General Petraeus oversaw as the head of CENTCOM, when he was hailed as this master of counterinsurgency. Well, he was fighting this insurgent group in which Mohammed Jolani was a rising member, Al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia. The next thing you know, he's on stage with the leader, with the AQIM figure who later became the founder of Jabhat al-Nusra, Al-Qaeda in Syria. If I were the mother of a veteran who died in Iraq, I'd be pretty disgusted and angry with Petraeus. And I would see this all as just, that I'd realize I would come to have to reckon with the reality that my son had just been a pawn in this great geopolitical conquest for the Middle East, the great game. And that's the role that Shara plays to Petraeus. Petraeus has been very close to the various players in U.S. intelligence who are managing the Syria dirty war. I would see him go into meetings. I once went to a meeting of the White Helmets, the Syrian White Helmets, which were a major sort of soft power card for the U.S. and Turkey and Qatar in the Syrian dirty war. And they came to Washington at the Atlantic Council, which is the unofficial think tank of NATO. And Petraeus was sitting right there in the front row. And then he went into a meeting with Riyad al-Saleh, the sort of ostensible head of the White Helmets, to a private meeting as they wanted to manage the dirty war, in which, subsequent to that meeting, the White Helmets made several false claims about chemical attacks, which triggered Western intervention. So Petraeus wants to continue to be a player in Syria. And when he says, what was the quote? Your victory is our victory.
Your success is our success.
Your success is our success. When Petraeus says our success, That includes the Israelis. I mean, it's all about guaranteeing Israel's strategic depth in Syria, which essentially means giving up the Golan. And my understanding of al-Shara, talking to Syrians who've been to Syria since he took over, who've known his thinking, and my own understanding of his thinking, is he's willing to trade off various parts of Syria, maybe not the Latakia coast. In exchange, I mean, he's willing to basically lay down before Israel. But his real objective is to transform the areas that he controls, the 4 main population centers, into a kind of Kandahar, and import this kind of Takfiri Islam into Syria, which a large percentage of the Syrian population rejects. That's his vision. That's what he truly believes in. And he is a shrewd player who is making all the right moves in order to do that. And it starts with selling out to the Israelis. And by the way, and Israel doesn't care if, Aleppo turns into Kandahar. And if anything, they prefer that. Remember what Moshe Ya'alon, the former Israeli defense minister, said during the Syrian dirty war. He said, I prefer ISIS in the Golan Heights on the Syrian side than I prefer the Syrian Arab Army and IRGC, because they're actually a competent fighting force that is committed to Palestine. ISIS, what are they? They're a joke.
Matt, looking at the Trump administration, Donald Trump was elected arguing that he is a negotiator. He wants to negotiate with Iran, with Russia. What's happening to dollar is because of these continuous, endless wars with Iran, Russia, with the region. But you look at the way that they're talking today. They're talking about Tomahawk missiles going to Ukraine. They're talking about a new war with Iran. Who's deciding in this administration? Who's the mastermind of the administration? Is there anybody there to be called mastermind, or it's a huge, some sort of division within the administration? 2 forces, 3 forces, factions are fighting each other within the administration.
Yeah, I would say there are various factions, but the factions that are winning represent the neoconservative faction that started this conquest, post 9/11 conquest under George W. Bush. So I keep saying that Trump's second term feels like the third coming of George W. Bush's first term. Lindsey Graham is the big winner on Ukraine. After Alaska, Trump has completely turned around and agreed to new weapons deals, freezing negotiations, and so is General Keith Kellogg. Donald Trump on the Western Hemisphere has ceded his agenda to Marco Rubio, who has quietly become the most important or influential figure within the national security bureaucracy, along with Stephen Miller, the sort of nativist fanatic who is backing up Rubio's plan to start to wage a war inside Venezuela. Rubio controls actually more cabinet level national security positions than anyone in the United States since Henry Kissinger. But he's certainly not as savvy an operator as Henry Kissinger, but he's getting his way. And so these 3 or 4 factions all have different agendas. The one faction that I think is losing out right now is the faction of Elbridge Colby, who is in Trump's kitchen cabinet of national security advisors, who is an anti-China fanatic, who sees the ultimate objective of U.S. empire to be neutralizing or weakening the Chinese threat as China supersedes the U.S. as a global economic power, using not military force, but trade and infrastructure and the Belt and Road Initiative and the expansion of BRICS. So Elbridge Colby would be terrified by the prospect of another conflict over Iran because it would further deplete U.S. THAAD missile stocks, which he would like, and I would think J.D. Vance, who's a figure from the Colby faction, or you could call it the Vance faction, would like to give those THAAD missiles to Taiwan or to Japan and the Philippines, which have just signed a defense pact, an anti-China defense pact. They want to militarize the Pacific Rim and contain China. And they're not able to do it because Israel, the United States keeps wasting THAAD missiles on this crazy little apartheid colony that can't stop attacking Iran. And at the same time, Ukraine has had to redeploy Patriot batteries even to defend Israel. The faction that wants to take on China ultimately would want a deal in Ukraine and has pushed for a deal in Ukraine that freezes lines around Kherson and Zaporozhye. And the lines are not frozen anymore. Russia continues to advance. Ukraine does not have manpower, no matter how much technical wherewithal they have to wage these sophisticated drone attacks or to use more advanced U.S. weapons, including Tomahawks, to attack inside Russian frontier regions. They just don't have the manpower, which means as long as those lines are not frozen, the U.S. will keep pouring more and more weapons in as Russia advances towards Odessa. So the real long-term imperialist planners inside the Trump administration are losing long-term as the Trump administration positions itself for conflicts that appease the factions that have a much more myopic vision. And I mean, it's three visions, as I said before. One, Rubio catering to the Gusano industrial complex in South Florida, which is a major key for Trump's electoral strategy, is to always win Florida. But also, I mean, Rubio has this ideological fervor that they share to destroy Venezuela. And then they think once Venezuela is destroyed, they will be able to topple the government in Cuba, which depends on Venezuelan exports and help. And then Nicaragua will be next. And then the region will be completely free for the U.S. to exploit. And then you have the Zionist neocon faction. Lindsey Graham is sort of fronting for them. They want to destroy Iran for ideological reasons. And then you have this third faction, which is focused on they're sort of like the traditional military leadership. They're focused on the revolving door. They're making loads of money through the $1 trillion defense budget, which is mostly going to contractors. Only like 6% actually goes to maintaining U.S. troops in the field. And they're just focused on profits and continuous war. And when they leave the Trump administration, they're going to rake in those profits. And then I should say there's sort of a fourth factor. I don't know if it's a faction, but a fourth factor. If you paid attention to Donald Trump's speech at Quantico, which is being minimized even by the people who hate Donald Trump the most in Washington, the liberals and so on. They're like, oh, he mocked. Basically, for those who don't know, Pete Hegseth, who is one of the least qualified defense secretaries just because of his rank and lack of experience, and is there basically because he's an effective communicator who is a former Fox News host. He convened 200 U.S. generals and high-ranking officers at Quantico. Many of them had to come across, some of them had to come across 10 time zones. And then he delivered this speech lacerating them for being fat and gay. I mean, that's basically what he said. He's like, we're not going to have any more dudes in skirts, and too many of you are too fat, and that's not who we are. And that was sort of treated as a joke by the media and even by liberals, but it's actually setting the stage for a politicized purge of the military in which Trump loyalists will be elevated to new positions and those who are perceived as Democrats will be ousted. Then Donald Trump comes on stage and he tries to get the military audience to laugh at his jokes. I found some of them are like classic Trump humor, like comedy, like he's opening up at a New Jersey nightclub or something. He's talking about how Obama bops down the stairs on Air Force One. And he thought that if there's laughter, it will show some kind of support for himself from the generals, like an organic support, but nobody laughed. So he sort of failed there. But if you parsed what Trump was saying, including his support and endorsement for Rubio's agenda against Venezuela, he called for using U.S. cities as training grounds for the U.S. military to essentially wage war on and pacify parts of the American public that he described as animals, essentially urban minorities and the poor. They're sending troops to Memphis this coming week, and there are plans to deploy in Chicago as well. But he talks about American cities as training grounds for foreign conflicts. We haven't heard this kind of language before. And as Trump does that, this is something Stephen Miller, his top advisor, wants, and a large part of his base wants. It diffuses the drive to actually send U.S. troops into a conflict theater in the Pacific Rim or in Iran. So you have all of these competing agendas and factions, and the faction that will lose here are the long-term, I think ultimately more dangerous imperial planners, and they're losing to the ideologues and the avaricious grifters in the military.
Okay, in this analysis, journalist Max Blumenthal examines why diplomatic efforts in the Middle East appear to have collapsed, focusing on the rapidly escalating tensions between Iran and Israel. Blumenthal highlights how recent regional developments, including the breakdowns of indirect negotiations, shifting alliance, and continued military strikes, have pushed both sides closer to confrontations. The discussions centers on Iran's accelerated military buildup, with Tehran reportedly strengthening its missile and drone programs, bolstering air defense systems, and deepening security cooperations with the regional partners. According to Blumenthal, this surge in military preparedness is driven by the belief that diplomacy has failed to deter potential Israeli attacks on Iranian facilities or its allies. Okay, this analysis also explores the geopolitical stakes. What are stakes? These are how US involvement and regional alliances are influencing standoff, why Iran believes it must project the strength to deter preemptive strikes, the potential risks of a wider conflicts if either side misescalates. These perspectives underscores the growing sense that the region is entering new, more volatile phase, where diplomatic options are sinking and the danger of military escalations is higher even ever. So for today this, and in upcoming video we'll take another new analysis report. For today, thank you for joining us. Do subscribe to us.